Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the Capitol Hill Ocean Week virtual session on tools for climate-resilient fisheries and fishing communities. I'm Reggie Peros, acting lead of the U.S. Fisheries and Oceans team at Environmental Defense Fund. The U.S. has some of the best managed fisheries in the world, which provide millions of jobs and billions of dollars in economic impact each year. Climate change and its impact on our ocean, our fisheries, and our fishing communities, however, threatens this progress. From shifting fish stocks to ocean acidification to sea level rise, these impacts pose substantial risks to the people who depend on the ocean and its resources for food, jobs, recreation, and culture. Fortunately, fishermen, scientists, resource managers, conservationists, and community leaders are teaming up to find solutions. Through collaborative, inclusive efforts backed by science and traditional knowledge, we are finding pathways toward more climate-resilient fisheries and fishing communities. Today, we will hear from three experts who are helping lead the way in the creation of these new tools and solutions. Michele Conrad is Principal Strategist at Oceanbeat Consulting, an ocean and coastal consulting firm. She has over 25 years of experience protecting ocean resources, developing and executing fisheries policy, and co-managing marine fish and shellfish fisheries with tribes. She spent most of her career as policy lead for intergovernmental fisheries and ocean issues with the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, and served for 15 years as the state's representative on the Pacific Fishery Management Council. Dr. Julia Mason is a social ecological systems scientist at Environmental Defense Fund, where she supports work related to building climate resilience in fisheries and food systems. Julia holds a PhD in biology from Stanford. Prior to joining EDF, she served as a Knauss Sea Grant Fellow for Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey. Melissa Arend is an economist at Northern Economics. Melissa has nearly a decade of experience spanning marine science, policy, and economics. Prior to joining Northern Economics in 2021, she worked as an economist at the New England Fishery Management Council and as a contractor at two NOAA Fisheries Science Centers in Washington and Massachusetts. In addition, Melissa spent a year working on the Hill as a Knauss Sea Grant Fellow for Washington Senator Maria Cantwell, working on a variety of fisheries and oceans issues. Melissa holds a Master of Science in Marine Resource Management from Oregon State University. Before we get started, I wanted to review a few house rules for this session. Please keep yourself muted throughout the session unless you've been called on to ask your question during the Q&A portion. Please feel free to insert questions in the chat throughout the session, and all virtual sessions are being recorded and will be available on the CHOW platform 24 hours after the session ends. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michele for our first presentation.
Great, thank you, Reggie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michele Conrad, and I'll be talking about a community resilience road mapping project in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. The Washington coastal region has only 4 ports, which are rural coastal communities that are spread out along the coast, with northern ports in very remote areas and located on tribal reservation lands. The northern area also overlaps with the Olympic National Park and the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. And the southern ports include Westport, which is at the entrance to Grays Harbor, and Ilwaco, which is at the mouth of the Columbia River, which serves as the border between Washington and Oregon. Both of these communities are very dependent on fisheries and highly vulnerable to climate and fishery impacts. Next slide, please. In talking through, apologies, can you go back to the previous slide? Thank you. I'd like to start with a high-level overview of the process and some of our best practices. So we were fortunate to have fisheries and fishing association leaders that were based in these communities who participated in this effort, and they helped us to identify other participants. We had 19 community participants in total. 10 of them were regular attendees, which I refer to as my core group. and those included appointees for the Pacific Fishery Management Council, on the Pacific Salmon Commission, local governments with cities and ports, fishing and fishing associations for commercial Dungeness crab, salmon, groundfish, shrimp, halibut, albacore, and charter fisheries, as well as fish buyers and fish processors. We also had 2 representatives from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife who also participate on the Pacific Fishery Management Council. The other 9 participants have attended meetings when they can and have engaged mostly through one-on-one conversations or by email. We've had 9 meetings so far, and we initially began with virtual meetings. And as venues started reopening, we switched to in-person meetings in Westport and continued the remote access option to maximize participation. Regular communication by email in between meetings has been critical to keeping the process moving. So I would provide updates, reminders, and follow-up. We would review language and finalize it by email, and having flexibility in the scheduling as schedule conflicts would arise. So we would coordinate that over email as well. It's very important that you celebrate progress. So what I refer to as small wins, the group operated by consensus, and they've done really well on working on the language to achieve that consensus and overall agreement with all of the participants. We make sure that all of the views are captured, and we sometimes I will need to call on people if I haven't heard from them in a while, or kind of prompt them to provide their comments to the group. Next slide, please. I want to stress that this is very much an iterative and ongoing process. We've spent a lot of time revisiting the issues and reviewing and reconciling the language. As ideas arise, I will make note for additional research, bring the information back to the group for group consideration. We would identify options and challenges, and I would be reminding them that this is their roadmap. So oftentimes they would look to me for recommendations or ask me for advice, and I would stress that my job is to bring them the information for them to consider it, and for this roadmap to be reflective of what their concerns and views are. We've spent a lot of time identifying the key decision makers and collaborators and partners, and the timing of the decision-making processes, focusing on the actions on what needs to be done to accomplish the goals of the roadmap, and also what the community group can do. So keeping an eye on the different roles and responsibilities, and stressing that the community members, either as a group or as individuals, can serve as advocates for the actions that they would like to see accomplished. We would then follow up with emails to solidify the language, as I mentioned, and I would document when there is agreement and then move on to the next topic. Next slide, please. So the roadmap components will consist of kind of a short, brief, graphic roadmap, as well as a longer, in-depth report that will include the background on the community, fisheries, their climate impacts and concerns. The community has developed a vision statement, and then they've organized their concerns by theme, key outcomes, and priorities. We've also, we're conducting an adaptive capacity assessment that's being done with a postdoc from the University of Washington, and is spent time interviewing the individual participants as well as the group to assess what their adaptive capacity is within these communities, and to compare that with the broader West Coast adaptive capacity assessment that was done for West Coast communities. That assessment will also do a comparison with what their perceived adaptive capacity is versus what the analyzed adaptive capacity is, and what steps they could do to improve their adaptive capacity. The roadmap has multiple purposes and audiences, so it serves as a community strategic plan for them to take actions to address their priorities and concerns to improve their resilience, particularly in the face of climate change. The roadmap is also a communication tool to broader stakeholders, the fishing association members and fishery participants. It will also be used to brief decision makers, and depending on the proposed actions, those would include the Washington congressional delegation, our governor's office, state legislature, the Pacific Fishery Management Council for fisheries in federal waters, local governments, and federal and state agencies. The roadmap also serves as a potential tool for communication tool to funders who may be looking to implement or helping the community implement initial roadmap actions, or as they apply for grant funding to complete some of those actions. This is also an overview of where we are in the process and timeline. So the first draft roadmap is almost complete. We will have 1 to 2 additional community meetings later this summer to review the draft and finalize the roadmap with a target completion date of October. Next slide. This is a summary of the process, and I really want to stress what the value of the process is higher than the actual product of the roadmap itself. And so by having those meetings locally, meeting the participants where they live, where they engage with each other, and kind of fostering that open communication, our discussions have been more conversational in nature. And then there's this need, mostly on my part, to listen to them and then interpret what they're saying in those conversations into those roadmap components to draft the report. So a lot of my time is spent checking in to review language to make sure it correctly captures what the community wants to say. And in general, we've had really good discussions. We're in a great place with solid agreement amongst the community members on their roadmap. Everyone is excited to complete the roadmap, and the communities are anxious to move forward with initial implementation action. Thanks, Reggie.
Thank you so much, Michele. I will now hand it over to our next presenter, Dr. Julia Mason.
Thanks, Reggie, and thanks, Michele, for the fantastic presentation. I'm going to zoom us out a little bit to share some national level work that we've been doing to support climate resilience, as well as a global effort that resulted in a resilience planning tool. So on our next slide, in the US, one of the big challenges in our efforts to prepare and adapt fisheries to climate change at the federal level that we've been hearing from our partners at NOAA, and that was also confirmed by the Government Accountability Office as one of the major conclusions of their report on barriers and opportunities for climate resilience in fisheries, is that we are generating a ton of climate knowledge and information. We've made great progress in understanding climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. We have better and better forecasting of what's going to happen in the future, but there's a bottleneck that climate knowledge is not being linked to management action. And there are a variety of reasons for this. One big one is a lack of on-ramps or kind of entry points for that climate information to be taken up by managers. There might just not be official processes by which they can formally take that information up, or it might not fit within existing mandates. And another challenge is that there actually are quite a few efforts that different offices and organizations are making toward climate-ready fisheries, but those efforts tend to be isolated. Everyone's kind of approaching this in their own way, and there's few opportunities or incentives to communicate or coordinate across regions. So we can kind of think of this as puzzle pieces that are all jumbled together in the box, or everyone's maybe working on their own little section, encountering the same obstacles and maybe reinventing things. And so that second part at least seemed addressable. So last summer, we hosted a virtual workshop to create an opportunity for some cross-regional learning. So we had representatives from 6 of the regional management councils, all of the different science centers and universities, to share some success stories from their emerging work to link climate knowledge with management action in their different regions. So we had some lightning storytelling talks, and then with deep dive breakout rooms and some interactive activities, we worked to distill common best practices and lessons learned from that emerging work. So we're kind of thinking of turning those puzzle pieces over to show the pictures, to give them names, and then to discuss how those might be put together in different contexts to address ongoing challenges that people were facing in their specific regions. So on the next slide, from this, we came up with 8 best practices from this emerging work. Of course, this is still early days. This is not a complete puzzle, but some of the key puzzle pieces that we found. One is that essential or enabling first step, or maybe the centerpiece, you might say, is this idea of mapping the management process. So what you're hearing in the workshop is that each council has its own unique procedure and timeline. And so before starting a new climate-informed initiative, kind of figuring out where those potential on-ramps already exist, where there might be choke points where you need to create new ones, can really make those efforts more efficient and effective by clarifying what kind of information to deliver and how to coordinate it with decision-making timelines. And so that kind of demonstrates how the rest of these pieces might fall into place. And then in this inner blue circle, we have a set of practices that are more applicable for internal management processes. One is to work smarter, not harder, by aligning any climate initiatives with existing management mandates, like ecosystem-based fisheries management. We talked about qualitative assessments and innovative approaches to include incorporating those because they're much more rapid and flexible. So they're going to be a really key tool for the uncertain and novel conditions that we're increasingly facing. And then a kind of strategic method about piloting any new climate initiatives with low controversy or low risk settings, starting happy to build some early momentum that can then be applied to more challenging situations. And then in this outer green ring, we had some practices, a suite of practices more applicable to initiatives with the broader public and stakeholders. So of course, stakeholders should be engaged early and often to bring everyone along. We talked about framing climate impacts in terms of local priorities and stakeholders' lived experiences instead of enforcing a top-down climate narrative. Employing structured stepwise processes guided by professional facilitators to keep processes on track. And leveraging collaborative research with fishermen and with other citizens to bring in other types of knowledge and to overcome capacity constraints. On our next slide, some of the key takeaways from this workshop is that there is a ton of progress happening throughout the US. But again, more opportunities for this cross-regional learning to overcome shared obstacles and accelerate progress are definitely needed. This idea of mapping out the management process as a key enabling step emerged as a really applicable process across regions. We unearthed a suite of great participatory approaches, tools like scenario planning and conceptual mapping that can engage diverse knowledge sources, and that these again need to be paired with specific on-ramps to management action to actually be incorporated. And then finally, while it's important that regions still have opportunities to continue to innovate with specific approaches that are suited to their contexts, there's really not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution here. Ideally, those efforts are also supported at the national level with investment and guidance to be able to meet the scale of these challenges. And so we have, we have a manuscript that will be forthcoming in the journal Marine Policy that we're revising right now, but we also have a 2-pager with some examples of these best practices in action and a longer report that I'm happy to share by email that I'll put in the chat. All right, thanks, DJ. We can go forward. I'm going to switch gears to another climate resilient fisheries planning tool, give a quick overview. This is something that EDF developed as part of a multi-institution in collaboration with a multi-institution working group on climate resilience funded by the Science for Nature and People Partnership, SNAP. On the next slide, our goal with this working group was to start to move the big hand-wavy world of academic resilience theory to something more tangible and operational. And so we did a big scan of the literature to distill attributes or building blocks of climate resilience that researchers had put forth as being relevant to fisheries. And we brought together ecological, socioeconomic, and governance fields to make a holistic framework. And then we sought to breathe life into these academic attributes with real-world narrative case studies. So we had experts in the working group on fisheries around the world, and they explored how these attributes were contributing to resilience or maybe not with a variety of different fishery contexts and climate stressors. And of these 18 case studies, we had 5 that were US relevant on a big variety of scales and contexts. So we have the Alaska Bering Sea pollock, California Dungeness crab, West Coast sardine, Atlantic highly migratory species, and Maine state lobster fisheries. And so these really illustrate those different attributes and how they work. So from what we learned from these case studies and this process or what we developed was an interactive web tool that goes through a 6-step process for any fishery practitioner or manager to assess resilience and prioritize interventions. And the way this works is on the next slide, it walks you through a process to map out your fishery system, the ecological, socioeconomic, and governance aspects to articulate your long-term goals for the fishery. Next slide. There is an activity to identify the potential climate impacts on your fishery, as well as other interacting and probably cumulative stressors, as well as to evaluate each of those climate resilience attributes and understand which are strong or weak, which might be contributing to resilience or limiting it. And then from that, it goes through an exercise to generate some potential climate resilience actions that would address those priority impacts. So for example, if in your system you were facing catch declines due to shifting stocks, a potential strategy might be to implement some more flexible access rights for different species or different fishing zones, as well as priority actions to help strengthen the attributes that are most important in your system. So if this was a system where the stock status attribute was really weak, maybe because a really important key commercial species was crashing because it was climate vulnerable, it might generate some strategies like climate-informed reference points in stock assessments or minimum harvest size limits. And so this tool is available as an interactive web tool, as well as a kind of PDF paper version on the Climate Resilient Fisheries .net website. You can use this QR code, and I think we'll put it in the chat as well. And it's also available as part of EDF's Climate Resilient Fisheries Toolkit. And there's also some academic papers associated with this work that I'm happy to share. So we encourage you to check these tools out and to reach out if you have questions. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Julia. And now I will turn it over to our final presenter, Melissa Aaron.
Thanks so much, Reggie. Thanks again. My name is Melissa Aaron. I'm with Northern Economics, and today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on for the last 1.5 years with EDF, where we've been developing shared stakeholder-backed principles for allocating fisheries under climate change. So first and foremost, why do we need shared principles? As anyone who's worked in fisheries or fisheries management knows, allocation issues are really difficult and really controversial, if not the most difficult and controversial in all of fishery management. And we really think that climate change further complicates allocations and allocation decisions by acting at a large scale, so affecting multiple fishery ecosystems, fishery management plans, and stocks simultaneously. And it also adds a lot of uncertainty about what the degree and magnitude of impacts might be like in the future. And then maybe most importantly, it also challenges our status quo approaches that historically we've allocated fisheries in the United States largely based on historical catch and effort. And so what do we do when historical catch no longer matches the distribution of current stocks as they moved and shift around? And so what does this mean for new fisheries and our current fisheries as things move around? So the objective of this work is really to develop a set of shared stakeholder-backed principles to help guide fishery allocation decisions in the United States. And we hope that these would be responsive to climate change dynamics as things change over time, but also complementary to established guidance, so fit within the framework of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the other related policy guidance and national standards that we have that look at allocation issues in the United States. And finally, we also hope that these would be broad enough that they're nationally applicable, but also mindful of regional differences. So in the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to give a whirlwind tour of everywhere that we've been in the last 1.5 years. And first, we'll just talk about how we developed the allocation principles and the one-day virtual convening with stakeholders around the country that we use to elicit their principles for shifting stocks and allocation. Then I'll talk about some of the ways that we evaluated the principles to see how consistent they are with recent fishery allocation actions. Third, I'll give a brief overview of a hotspot analysis that looks at where allocation challenges might occur under climate change in the future. And then fourthly, I'll talk about some of the work that we've done to communicate the principles and also figure out what our next steps will be. So the first thing that we did in this project was just talk to people all over the United States, as many stakeholders as we could get a hold of, to talk to them about their experiences with allocation and the challenges that they're expecting that they're going to have in the future. And as you can see from this map, we were able to talk to people from most of the major fishery management regions around the United States, and as well from a variety of different stakeholder groups, but with a little bit more emphasis on harvesters and harvester associations. And next slide. What we used these interviews for was to put together a one-day virtual convening to talk about all these topics in more depth and really start to figure out what the principles would be. And we developed a variety of exercises to lead stakeholders through a variety of tools to have simple ideas about what the principles for fishery allocation systems under climate change should look like, and then building up to more complex ideas. And this shows the results of one of those early exercises where we had everyone just give a word or two about what they thought a climate resilient allocation system should consider. And as you can see in this word cloud, some of the top ideas that were raised by people at the meeting were things like flexibility, sustainability, equity, and security, but range from everything from treaty rights, profitability, communities, and of course, future trends. So one of the last exercises that we did after leading everyone through sort of an iterative exercise of bringing individual ideas for principles, then grouping them together based on similar themes, and finally coming together and seeing what the commonalities between all the ideas were, is that we were able to come up with these 8 final principles. And each of these finished the sentence, a climate resilient allocation system is one that. And firstly, it's one that considers all impacted communities and stakeholders, so really ensuring that everyone's at the table. But secondly, it also promotes dynamic self-management. So this really means bottom-up management. So what are the ways that stakeholders and participants can really take control of their access and their allocations individually, either through market-based or other community-based mechanisms? Third, climate resilient allocation system considers the equity issues associated with changing non-target species. So are you considering both the fisheries as we typically think of them with, one or multiple target species, but what about the other species that that fishery interacts with? Fourth, it ensures conservation, sustainability of the resource and biodiversity of the ecological system, so very consistent with our MSA mandates. And fifth, it also incorporates adaptability in the regulatory structures. So in what ways can we make our fishery management processes just more responsive to changing conditions? So can you expedite the fishery management process to make changes to allocation systems when necessary? Sixth, it also recognizes historical and traditional dependence. This echoes that even though we've always used historical dependence and activity to allocate fisheries, participants really wanted to emphasize this is still very important to recognize in future allocation decisions. And then lastly, a climate resilient fishery allocation system ensures transparent, inclusive, and meaningful co-management, as well as utilizes and integrates diverse knowledge sources. So when we looked at how consistent these principles are with some recent allocation measures and actions in the United States, we really saw that there's a pretty broad range of how consistent they are with these principles. So in the middle are the 3 principles that really showed strong consistency with the principles. So almost all of the allocation actions that we looked at ensured conservation and sustainability of the resource, especially since this is an MSA mandate. That isn't so surprising, but was a little surprising is that they all incorporated adaptability in the regulatory structures. And so this was most commonly making allocations frameworkable, so making it a little bit faster to make those changes through the Fishery Management Council process. By contrast, the ones on the left, those first three were only partially considered. So either were not very clear or maybe not present at all in some of the fishery management actions that we looked at. In particular, promoting dynamic self-management was not really evident, since we typically still rely on static divisions of quota to manage a lot of fishery allocations in the United States. And lastly, on the right-hand side, the last two principles were not entirely evident, and it's not because that these aren't being used or that this isn't part of the fishery management process, but rather it's a little bit difficult to measure what this really means and what success along these principles means, which is really a priority for the next steps of this work, which we'll talk about more a little bit later. So really quickly, third, I want to talk about a hotspot analysis that we did to try to see where allocation challenges might occur. And this is a super complicated analysis and maybe even a more complicated figure, but really all you need to know from this figure is that when you combine an indicator of how complex and static allocation measures are with projections of what climate change impacts might be at the fishery management plan level, so for all species that we can get projections for within an FMP, what we can really see is that when you have really complex and static fishery management measures and high exposure to future climate change impacts, you can really start to see which FMPs might be the most vulnerable to future changes. And these are fisheries like the Gulf of Alaska groundfish fishery, the West Coast groundfish fishery, as well as the South Atlantic snapper grouper fisheries. So all fisheries that have complex recreational, commercial, and potentially even catch share sectors within their fishery management plans. So lastly, for the last 6 months or so, we've really been focused on communicating the outcomes of this work so far. So we've been talking to NOAA headquarters, and we've also been talking to the regional fishery management councils and really working on also thinking about what our next steps should be. So as I mentioned, one of the priorities is to figure out how do you measure success against these principles. And so for that, we're really focused on having some additional national level conversations with our stakeholders, potentially a broader group of stakeholders from different backgrounds to really test, refine, and come up with some ways to measure success of these principles, in addition to having some regional level conversations that can dig into more of the specific needs that each of the regions require to sort of adapt and think about what they're going to need in the future under climate change. So some of the key takeaways is that we really think that these principles are the first step in ensuring that management plans are prepared for changes. And through those 8 principles, they really highlight the need for rules that are nimble and also allow for bottom-up management. And when we look at recent allocation actions, we see that some actions really align well with these principles. So some of the councils are already doing a lot of this work, but more work is needed to develop the metrics to get a little bit more robust in terms of how we're measuring success and also identify regional strategies. Through the hotspot analysis, we saw that multi-species and some of those catch share managed FMPs might be the ones that experience the greatest future allocation challenges, just because they might have high degree of projected climate change impacts and just have lots of really complicated and static rules. And then finally, our future work is really going to focus on how we can put these into practice. And some of the things that we're looking at are the National Standard 4 guidance updates, as well as the changes to the allocation policy directive, which are both forthcoming. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and to all of our panelists for those great overview of the different tools and solutions that we have been working on for climate resilient fisheries and fishing communities. So we will now transition into our Q&A discussion portion. And to get us started, I just have a few questions for our panelists. So first question is for Michele. And Michele, I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about any key lessons that were learned from your work with the 2 communities in the Pacific Northwest that may be helpful to other communities that are looking to complete similar roadmaps.
Yeah, thanks, Reggie. I noted that there were a few key components of best practices that overlapped with the EDF project that was presented by Dr. Mason. So engaging the stakeholders early and often, emphasizing the local priorities and providing that structured process. So many of the community members have known each other for a long time. They have never really discussed the potential concerns that they have for potential climate impacts to their fisheries and communities. So they've never really had that forum to have that discussion, even though most, if not all of them, shared the same concerns. So it really helped to have some one-on-one conversations with the individual members to kind of draw them out and listen to them ahead of time. And then from those conversations, I was able to identify some common themes and then be able to prompt them to share those concerns with the broader group in that setting for them to be able to see that they had some common ground. So this led to them feeling more comfortable and confident and open about sharing their thoughts with each other.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michele. Dr. Mason, can you talk about some of the possible on-ramps that managers might be able to use to incorporate climate information into fishery management?
Sure. So these are going to be really different depending on the particular region and the particular management processes. But this on-ramp metaphor was developed by and we adopted from the North Pacific Fishery Management Council and their Bering Sea Climate Change Task Force. And they identified 3 categories of on-ramps that I think are pretty broadly applicable. So the first is near-term tactical on-ramps. So this would be like incorporating climate forecasts or red flags for how climate is going to affect a species into the annual stock assessment process and delivering that information right before that stock's going to be considered. They also talked about near-term strategic on-ramps. This would be maybe providing forecasts of species distribution shift when a council is evaluating protected area boundaries or identifying future tipping points in an ecosystem status report. And then finally, there is a longer term strategic on-ramps like 5 or 10 years out. This would be where scenario planning might come into play, identifying key knowledge gaps, potential adaptive management approaches to experiment with, and even trying to develop new on-ramps where more climate information can inform management.
Great, thank you so much. If you do have a question for the panelists, feel free to go ahead and insert it in the chat. And with that, my final question that I have is for Melissa. And Melissa, allocation decisions are among some of the most contentious fishery management decisions that managers have to make. And I was wondering if you could talk about how these allocation principles could be useful to help lower the temperature of some of these allocation discussions.
Thanks, Reggie. I think the hope here is really that if fishery managers get ahead of these issues and really look at their goals and objectives that they have in their FMPs and specific to different allocation related measures like a catch share program, but they really can start to incorporate these principles and make sure that they have a vision for what success looks like and what equitable and fair outcomes look like for their fisheries under climate change well in advance of the issues that come into play. And so that's one brewing mechanism is that, through the allocation trigger process, when they review them periodically, that's something that they go through is looking at their goals and objectives and potentially revising them if changes are needed. And that can also be very contentious, but it is an opportunity that they can use. And another way is also just through that trigger process. How often and in what ways are they triggered to look at their allocation policies? And so that's another way that they can incorporate these and start thinking about how they can sort of be setting themselves up for success, potentially before they even have those challenges in play.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I am not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So with that, thank you all so much for attending this session to learn more about the various tools and resources for building climate resilient fisheries and fishing communities. As a reminder, this session was recorded and will be available on the CHOW platform 24 hours after the session ends. Thank you all again for attending and look forward to seeing you around CHOW. Thank you so much.